Hello, hello. So, welcome to what, in my mind, has been one of the most exciting episodes in the works for Spark Talk. And it's because today we're talking about Turkey and Kurdistan. And to talk about these two places with me, I have a Turkish person and actually a Greek person. So, comrades, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Hi, my name is Ozan.
And I'm Anna.
Cool. All right. So, again, on a more serious note, why I'm really excited about this is because anybody who's been following this for a while or knows anything about Spartacus League, we haven't written about Turkey, let alone Kurdistan, for a very long time. And it just so happens that there's been a huge kind of developments happening in Turkey recently. We saw really big protests against Erdogan. And we saw really a huge change in the Kurdish struggle, I'll just read out the headlines of these two articles because that's what we'll be discussing. So, on Turkey, we'll get to what's happening, but we have an article in Workers' Vanguard, the latest issue, which is called Down with Erdogan and Down with NATO. I would like you guys to talk about what's going on and why are we raising these calls. And the other one on Kurdistan, we have Öcalan and Rojava, No to the Betrayal, because what has just happened is really an absolutely historic betrayal. Öcalan has basically called on the guerrillas to down their arms, and what does that mean for the Kurdish liberation struggle and the region more broadly going forward? So, to that end, why don't we start a little bit with what's happening?
Well, sure. I mean, the situation in general in the Middle East has been getting very intense. Certainly a reflection of like the change of the world. Like it represents itself very hard in the Middle East. The Syria started happening. It's a question of Rojava there, a big economic crisis that directly affected these countries greatly, especially like this hyperinflation and crazy situation in Turkey.
What is the inflation percentage in Turkey? It's like 50 or something percent?
For the Turkey, they say 50, but I think the number is more close to like 70s or something like that.
That's been very normal, as I understand it, for some time.
Yes, exactly. Especially like after 2018, insanity of that situation kind of became normal there.
The Middle East. I mean, I think, the thing is, like, these developments in these regions can't be understood outside the whole Middle East.
But in like the same reflection, like the way it has been playing out in Turkey is there's obviously a big resentment against the horrendous economic situation, the horrendous life situation. Even like there was like 30% raise recently on the minimum wage, which is like totally toppled by the enormous inflation, which means nothing. And there was like a wave of strikes, struggle, and also very hard state repression, like especially on the question that this protest blew out. Back in the summer, there was a lot of elected Kurdish people were getting arrested in the Kurdistan region in Turkey. In what it kind of became like the biggest trigger was the opposition, the Kemalist Party's candidate for presidency, who has been getting some kind of traction, especially since the 2023 elections, which was a big loss for Erdogan. And they basically doubled down on the repression, arrested also him, and they blew up in a very big protest.
I actually remember the Istanbul mayoral elections were such a big deal. I think all the Western press wrote about how this represents a big opposition and a big challenge to Erdogan. I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about why. Why did Erdogan make this move?
Well, if I can say a few things, I think it's important what Ozan was saying earlier, that actually and I think this is also connected to the Kurdish question. I think these questions are kind of interlinked. Erdogan, everybody, kind of most of people think that he acts from a position of strength. But actually, this is not true. Like we have, the New World Order, the US actually would like Turkey to play an even more like a role for them in the Middle East as a subordinate actually player. Because the main thing with Turkey for US is so important because of its geostrategical position. But at the same time, we have this new turn in the world. But also at the same time, Erdogan is facing quite a lot of opposition from the working class and the poor, like as Osam has said. And from the other hand, you have Imamoglu, who represent a threat actually for the next presidential elections in 2028. Like, actually, it's kind of funny. It's a bit tragic and comic because what Erdogan has done to Imamoglu, actually the Kemalists have done to Erdogan before.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah. Like he was, I think he was a mayor, right? When they got arrested, actually. He got arrested. He was in prison.
And that made probably Erdogan popular amongst.
Yeah, he did. He was more popular about that. And like now it's a kind of repetition because like whoever, like Erdogan himself has said, whoever has Istanbul has Turkey.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it's just he squeezed, between these two situations, and he really tries to remain in power. I think that's quite important to remain in power. So basically, he goes more towards authoritarianism for various reasons, but he's really squeezed. So he did these moves not out of strength, but actually out of fear, I think, and of a weakness position on how he would continue his rule.
How about we talk a little bit about Imamoglu? So who is this guy? Because obviously there's been huge protests in Istanbul. Why is this figure able to... well, first, actually, am I correct in saying that these protests are in favor of Imamoglu? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So who's this figure and what's his perspective, and why is the opposition, that's amongst the working classes, why is that being channeled into Imamoglu?
Like he gained some popularity, like again with the conditions, economic conditions, etc. He started running on like some kind of in a populist way. He represented a more, I guess, like friendly way in the CHP itself. And he was like more softer on the Kurdish question, which it is very polarizing, obviously.
I think also he's coming from kind of from Trabzon, isn't it? From the Black Sea. So it's kind of more more rural. It's not rich areas. And I think he's also like a football guy. He appealed like a more friendly, like closer to the people. But I think it really has to do quite a lot with opposition against Erdogan, from the economic situation. And the thing with Imamoglu is that he has influence among, leftists, Kurdish, I'm not sure actually, pro-Western elites, intellectuals, and all of that. But his weak point, I think, towards Erdogan is like Erdogan is very experienced in the streets, how to smash actually. So I think of that, Imamoglu doesn't actually has much, I think, of a chance. He's really experienced, with a coup, can defend coup and all of that, the Gezi Park protests.
Okay.
But there's still illusions in Erdogan, which we can talk maybe a bit after.
Because I guess one of the things that as you're talking, one of the things I've been thinking about is, well, Erdogan's base. Yes, and the rest of the countryside. And from my understanding, it was really a lot of the people in the rural areas that looked to Erdogan and that were really strong bases of support for him. But I guess Istanbul being the more, urban, bourgeois center, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a bit of a polarization happening in the country. Would that be correct to say? Or
Erdogan's rise of power came from addressing the questions of a very conservative rural masses that in Kemalism they didn't see any development. So he came on a program which had some kind of this neoliberal aspects to it. It did a lot of development, and when Kemalists in the 2000s were saying, "How is my vote is equal to a vote of a peasant?" in a very very chauvinistic.
Sounds disgusting.
It is disgusting. Obviously, these masses moved to the conservative side, and Erdogan became a voice for that. With these developments, like infrastructure, although done in a very poor way, it was nothing that was seen in those regions, like these housing projects, etc. I think the recent earthquake was in a place that had benefited greatly from those developments. It gave a lot of support to Erdogan. But the contradictions of that is seen, it's tens of thousands of people died, and showed how actually poorly, the contradiction of that kind of neoliberal development.
But also it shows, I think, especially the earthquake. You called it in Turkish, I forgot, the houses that built in one night has a specific...
Gecekondu.
Gecekondu. So it's really houses that they built of so poor material. It's really the poorest of the poor that live there. And when the earthquake, happened, collapse like this, that it just shows is another expression, shows the combined and even development of Turkey. I think that's, in Istanbul, you have the airport, for example, it's so modern, it's amazing. Or, luxury stores and stuff like that. At the same time, in the Eastern, in Istanbul itself, to be honest, there's no drinking water, but yeah.
Like Levant, like it's like the financial district of Istanbul. You can see that like the stark difference that like these skyscrapers are towering over these gecekondos, these like like favela type neighborhoods.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming back to the events that triggered these demonstrations. So Imam was in jail. Yes. We're obviously for his release.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, just to make that clear. But okay, so what's the movement really like? What are its demands? What's its character? What's happening with the movement? Because I know there were really big protests a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if that's still ongoing. What's the situation in terms of the opposition and where is it going?
I think in a certain way the movement itself is mixed. It is a movement against Erdogan's repression, but in terms of what pieces this they look is like and you go look at the student movement, the students that were doing that, or like the more bigger protests. It's very mixed. Some very like Turkish nationalists there. There was also Kurds and a lot of poor also attended. It's in a way it's polarized, but it's like shows a certain sentiment against the very starkly increasing economic and like life situation, the life price and the repression.
And I think it's calling for justice, for democracy, obviously release, all the prison, including Imamoglu, of course. But it's I think it's kind of like Imamoglu is very prominent. I think it's important what Ozan was saying before. The repression is not just happened with Imamoglu. It's like months that is like Kurdish leftists, including many leftists actually, they have faced repression, and even like in these demonstrations, like many members of the Communist Party of Turkey and some members of the DAP also, which of course were also for their release. But it really shows, but with Imamoglu it's like a very prominent. So that was kind of the icing, how you say, the top of the cake, we say in Greece. I don't know how to say that in English, but like that sparked all of that. It's for democracy. I think it's mixed, but I think the problem is that it hasn't been a struggle like to unite actually what the masses need, I think, with the democracy, and that nobody can actually reply or give an answer to is like how you're gonna go towards democracy, how you advance the struggle of the workers and the poor.
Well, don't say nobody, because we have an article, as I said. So our article, right, we're saying down with Erdogan, fair enough, correct, obvious, makes sense. But down with NATO. Why is this important for this movement and for Turkey?
I think to understand like why we say down with NATO, like Turkey, if you see it historically, was never kind of actually a bourgeois democracy. It was always like very the best it was kind of semi-bourgeois democracy to like dictatorships a lot. And that actually shows, it's typical example of of a country which is squeezed between imperialism from one hand and with a strong presence of NATO. Like Turkey is Turkish army is literally linked with NATO army. But even if we go back, like it's a typical example of what Trotsky describes, that it's a national weak bourgeoisie of a semi-colonial country, which is squeezed between imperialism from one hand and actually quite strong proletariat in Turkey on the other, and how between the two always kind of faces Bonaparte's or semi-Bonaparte's rule to coups. So the question of NATO, it's important because it directly, like Turkey is directly linked with NATO. Historically, the army of Turkey, it was mainly Kemalist in the majority of history. Always kind of the role was like to align with the West, and actually that started even before the founding of the Republic of Turkey, like when it was still Ottoman Empire, the early days from the Young Turks. So the army was always playing the role, including NATO, obviously, how to align with the West, or in this case, how to be further under the boot of US imperialism through NATO. And I think it just shows how squeezed Erdogan is between the two. Like I said before, it's very important for the US, for Turkey to play a more role for the interest, but Turkey is just more squeezed, I think, from one side from the workers and the poor and state of the economy, and the other side from the New World Order, Trump, with this pressure to subjugate even further will increase. So to make it more concrete about the army and how it's connected always with that, I think that the 1980 coup is really a very important example. Because why the coup happened, and this is a paradox. The coup happened in 1980 to liberalize, actually. That's funny, it's really a paradox to liberalize Turkey, towards, open free market under US domination, liberal world order, to open the market of Turkey, privatizations and all of that. It happened a coup. But in other countries, the US, needed to stop the coups, like in Greece, to liberalize, kind of. And then you had this paradox. So the coup happened precisely for this, for the internal scene, if you like, but also because at that period in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, but also at the same time, it was Iran, get rid of the pro-US monarch. So basically, that was very important for the US to really have a strategic ally, which Turkey started to become even more strategic precisely because they lost Iran. So you see this connection always between the Turkish army, the increase of authoritarianism, and the role of the US, of US imperialism. So I think that's what kind of is happening now, which I think is just probably the beginning, because, like I said, the pressure from imperialism, it will squeeze Turkey even more, I think.
So you have mentioned Kemalism, Kemalist parties a couple of times, but I think it's important to talk a little bit more about it, just to, I think, bring the different questions together, because, it really brings home the question of how to advance the struggle. The struggle, is kind of has lots of illusions in Imamoglu and any kind of opposition to Erdogan, but, Kemalism actually is an obstacle to advancing this struggle. So I think we need to get our listeners to understand what is Kemalism. To understand anything about Turkish politics, you need to know this. Yeah.
So it's, most basic contradictions we are talking about today, from, for workers' rights to, women question, secularism, this, that. You have to deal with Kemalism. So Kemal was the leader of the Turkish independence against the imperialist occupation. And, there was certain progressive developments, and these reforms were made in the country through that movement. That's, for example, Turkey was never a colony when you compare it to some of the other countries in the region. Or question of women and secularism. Turkey had suffragette rights before France. So there was a struggle against, the Ottoman, that kind of religious glue. And, these certain modern developments were made. But I think going to the question of how under imperial subjugation, the limitation of bourgeois nationalism and how it takes a very reactionary role is so sharp in Turkey. Like that example plays and the Kemalist regime, they ran in early 90s from promising certain autonomy to Kurdish nation there. Just in a few years, turns a very reactionary role, and the story is basically just pogroms, massive repression, massacres, and...
Okay, interesting. So actually just an anecdote. First time I visited Turkey, went to a couple of different places. You just see Ataturk's photos in grocery stores. Everywhere you go, you see photos, which to me, coming from India, it's like having a photo of Gandhi everywhere. It's really like the father of the nation. And I think the thing with these kinds of figures is that because they are so revered and they're almost like this national icon, it's like, oh, well, they gave us independence. So how could this be an obstacle to the interests of the people? I think that's often like a really big illusion in some people. But one of the key points we're saying, is that the Kemalists can in no way lead the struggle, right? Mm-hmm. To push this forward, it has to be linked to the fight against imperial subjugation. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about how the Kemalists hold back the fight against imperialism. What's the role of the Kemalists today in Turkey?
Well, I can say one thing about, maybe not about now, but start a little bit with 2023 elections, where, it was Kılıçdaroğlu at the head of the Kemalists, which is the same party, with where Imamoglu is now. But the Gandhi of Turkey, as the company, basically, but for his low tones, but they were really pro-imperialist, openly, pro-US, correct me if I'm wrong, Ozan, but pro-US, pro-European, you know, which I think, you know, if the masses in Turkey, like I've been 1 month in Turkey, like at some point, and the people talk about three things: politics, football, food, you know, and in the first minute you talk to them, you understand that they hate the American bourgeoisie. They absolutely hate the American bourgeoisie.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Like, so why is that? You know, this is because of their oppression. You know, NATO is just huge. Like, who controls the whole region? Everybody knows,
Yes.
maybe except on the left. In Turkey. But that's the problem. That's the point. So the Kemalists are really pro-imperialists, and I think that's why also Erdogan, which we can talk a bit later maybe about it, but like there's still illusions in Erdogan because, you know, he's a right-wing populist and as a reaction actually to liberalism and US domination of the world, actually posture himself as anti-imperialist, where the Kemalists are openly like this. And that's how actually in 2023, like Kılıçdaroğlu and the Kemalists lost the elections because what Erdogan was saying, you know, that like they're vassal of the West, the Trojan horse of the US and blah, blah, blah. So that's, you know, and actually the Western press really wanted Kılıçdaroğlu to win. So the masses actually voted the opposite and Erdogan remained in power. So
I mean, another, you know, in 2023, basically, the question was like, okay, we need to get rid of Erdogan. You know, the situation was getting worse in the country. We need to get rid of Erdogan. You cannot talk about anything until we get rid of Erdogan. So there was basically some kind of a popular front behind the Kemalists. And then the question of NATO, I just want to give, I think, a small anecdote. I think it makes sense is that, you know, like some workers' parties like the TIP was able to get some popularity after the work they did with the earthquake, did not vote against Finland joining NATO. So, you know,
this is a workers' party that did not vote against Finland joining NATO.
And like, you know, if you go to the streets, yes, like if you slip on a banana peel, you're like down with US imperialism. Like, doesn't matter, you know, the sentiment is, people understand, you don't have to explain that. But when you're just like, you know, making that point, but totally capitulating to this kind of like Kemalism is what's basically undermining your whole struggle, what you're trying to achieve on the question. That is like the root of what the issue is to begin with.
And the Popular Front, if I'm not mistaken, was like from very right-wing forces to Kurdish forces.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically like there was a anti-Erdogan fascist split from the Nationalist Women's Party, Grey Wolves, and it's basically Kurds, workers, fascists. It was a mess.
That does sound like a mess. Yeah. This, I mean, listen, as somebody who knows very little about the region, when you say Kurds in an alliance with Turkish fascists, that to me breaks my brain. I don't understand how that is. But I mean, Anna, you mentioned at the start that you also need to understand Kurdistan and the Kurdish question and what's happening in order to make sense of both, you know, Erdogan and the protests against him. So I guess maybe now we can start turning a little bit to Kurdistan and discuss the recent developments there. So February 27th, why is that a huge deal for the Kurdish liberation movement? Also,
like talking about fascists, so like going into this. So the leader of the pro-Erdogan Grey Wolf basically made a statement this fall, said, bring Öcalan, who's, you know, considered the leader of the
mythical, heroic figure, yes.
Yeah, like an idolized figure. And he said, bring him to the parliament and let him make a statement. They call it the democratic process, basically try to resolve in quotes, the Kurdish issue through these diplomatic means and capitulate, like, you know, ties with the Turkish bourgeoisie. And then later, you know, they started sending a delegation. They had some discussions, and they later, in February 28th, there was a statement. I think it's a very significant statement from Öcalan, which basically capitulates the liberation, the struggle for Kurdish liberation, calls for Kurdish militias to disarm, and for PKK to dissolve itself. Basically, disarmament means death to PKK, basically. So this is totally a massive betrayal. And the reason is also kind of clear. Like we talked about the Imamoglu rising, and Erdogan had some kind of certain base and popularity from the Kurdish people, especially in the rural areas, etc. So it was an attempt to, again, another like, when he was squeezed in the situation, an attempt to gain some kind of vote back through this deal, and Öcalan capitulated to it. So basically subordinated the liberation movement on a act that was done just for the interest of the Turkish bourgeoisie itself.
That's quite disgusting. I mean, I know that, when I was becoming political, I was turning toward the left. Rojava was a huge question, the Rojava revolution. And Öcalan is really this super heroic figure. And, when we were putting out Women in Revolution a couple of months ago, we were doing some photo research and looking at photos of these Kurdish women who were armed. It's so brilliant at this heroic willingness to sacrifice to fight for your national liberation. I think it just how you explain, Öcalan's asking those women, the thousands that have probably been murdered, etc. It's just an absolute spitting on all the sacrifices of that struggle, and it just really is criminal. But maybe we can elaborate a little bit. I mean, of course, that's a very big, complicated thing. You need to talk about multiple different countries, but at least in relation to, in order to make sense of at least Öcalan's betrayal, right? Maybe explain a little bit, what was happening, what was happening with the struggle, and why at this stage did this happen?
I mean, I think, well, you're going to talk a little about what happened in Syria too.
Yes, of course.
So Rojava was achieved during a big turmoil, and forces were shifting in the country itself drastically, up to 2011. There was a certain answers that was able to make for the Kurdish people's sentiment for liberation, and even some other groups like Druze, etc., on certain questions, like some social and democratic achievements were made, was done there. And later, I think this is very important to understand what undermined the achievements of the Rojava itself was the alliance with the US. While they did an objective alliance initially to basically, defend themselves against ISIS from the threat of extinction, which is fine, but then going on to offensive allied with the US in Raqqa, and that's basically aroused anger.
It just deepened all the divisions in the region.
Exactly.
So now the Kurds in alliance with the imperialists are going after the Sunni Arabs.
Exactly.
It's a mess. It just makes everything worse.
With Assad's fall, Turkey started a big encroachment on the border that separates Baku from Rojava, which is North Kurdistan from Rojava, and they were in a very isolated situation. And first Öcalan's statement basically capitulating to the Turkish bourgeoisie. And then it was I think 10, 11 days later, SDF basically, the Syrian Democratic Forces main, leader, lead in the Rojava basically shook hands with Jolani. He was the leader of the new Syrian Arab Republic.
I think it's important, how we write in the statement, that this betrayal is from both, actually. It's the natural outcome.
What do you mean, sorry, from both?
From Öcalan and from the Rojava, it's really that's what's happening. If you collaborate with the enemy that oppresses you, because the Kurdish question is an international question. It's not just a Turkish question. No. It's an international question. It has a great importance for the imperialists in the region, obviously, which are responsible actually for what is happening. And that's why it's important, like we say, the only way forward is really to unite population, the masses, against the imperialists. But this betrayal, if you allow me to make a little bit a parallel example, which has nothing to do with Turkey, but really, when I heard that, then I think that's also what shows the state of the Turkish left, which the majority of it, at least, reject to say that it's an open betrayal. It reminded me a little bit, and the consequence is going to be disastrous. They will not have even the material that they need, guns, to defend themselves from Syria, from Turkey. And, it's really disgusting, I have to say. And what reminds me a little bit, maybe is very different, especially with Rojava, it reminded me what happened in Greece with the Mansa agreement, which is very different because it was a civil war and the Communist Party had actually power, against the British. Basically, they had Athens, to be honest, and then they gave up. And they made this agreement and say to the partisan, surrender your weapons. And what happened after? It was white terror. First of all, a civil war was lost. It is different situations, obviously. But what is common, the common thread, is that they expect that came after actually completely collaborating with the national bourgeoisie and with the progressive, in quotes, imperialists of the time, like the British and the US.
Right.
So that's precisely, this is the common thread that reminds quite a lot of Rojava, like in Öcalan, which that's why it constitutes such a huge betrayal. Because we don't expect that a nationalist leadership will actually bring victory to this, but to give up what you already have, it's absolute betrayal of this.
You mentioned when you were talking about the Turkish left and how they refuse to call this a betrayal. Can you help us make sense of why that is?
The problem is really the nationalist leadership of the Kurdish movement, I think. I think they're very soft. Like, why are they avoiding to say that it's, most of them, it's a betrayal? I think it's literally because they don't see a proletarian strategy independent, like to take the leadership even away from the Kurdish leaders, to be honest. I mean, thinking about it, okay. Like in Rojava, right? Like in Rojava, they openly collaborated with the imperialists, okay? So rejecting to say that the leadership of the national liberation movement rejected to say that this is a betrayal, in my opinion, is also a capitulation to the nationalist leadership, which they don't see, that this is an obstacle actually for the liberation struggle. Of course, we have a side, like against their oppression, absolutely. At the same time, is a capitulation to imperialism, because if you're really very soft on this question of betrayal, you cannot actually fight for a leadership that can unite the Kurdish, the Turks, the Syrian, and all the region against the imperialists. Because, like I said, the Kurdish question, it is an international question. So I think it shows also that they don't have a program of how to fight imperialism in the region, I think, basically. I think that's what is the problem. Although there are forces who are opposed to the Kurdish liberation, what's more right-wing, like the Stalinists.
So I think one theme that emerges from both of these articles, and not just these, I'm really glad we've been talking a little bit about Syria in this context as well. And when we published that article, the headline was "Only anti-imperialism can unite the peoples of Syria." I think in each of these questions, as you've been talking about, you cannot understand these problems outside of imperialism. And the whole point is you need to unite these different struggles in opposition to imperialism, right? And there are sometimes great obstacles to uniting in the different struggles, to uniting, Turkish and Kurdish workers and so on. It just reminds me that in London, there's this left group, they published this paper called Weekly Worker. They literally reprinted Öcalan's statement. So I know, oftentimes when it comes to the national question, the left is totally clueless in terms of how to deal with it. They just cheer it on because, it's the struggle of the oppressed. Because they really have no perspective of actually figuring out how to guide it. And I think the way Ozan just explained, how the whole strategy of Rojava from the last decade or so led them to a position of isolation, of weakness. Confronted with the weakness, Öcalan, gave in. He capitulated. And actually, so I think what I'd like you guys to comment on a little bit is why these nationalist strategies, why are they such an obstacle to unity?
Well, collaborating against the question of imperialism, I think. Because collaborating, like putting your faith to the main oppressor of the world proletariat, and to be honest, of that region has suffered so many from the imperialists for centuries, basically. To put your faith in them is like alienate all the Arab, Turkish masses from the national liberation of the Kurds, because the national leaders actually, by capitulating to the imperialists, and Ozan mentioned before the massacre that they did together, the US, against the Arab masses, that actually they cannot bring this necessary unity. They're an obstacle to bring precisely this necessary unity between the Kurds, the Turks, against the imperialists, because that's the only way actually to resolve any kind of question there. So that's one thing. That's why we always say it needs proletarian leaders. The other problem for Turkey in particular is that there are many among the left who reject actually that Turkey is oppressed by US imperialism. So if you reject that struggle and you're just hailing with whatever, only the Kurdish struggle against, you have a division among the working masses of both nations. So for the Turkish workers to take, of course it's in their interest to fight as the best fighters, for Kurdish liberation. If you speak or their national aspirations, then you cannot actually do that. So you need to combine the national liberation of Turkey against imperialism and take it up, the Kurdish liberation, including for the national self-determination from Turkey, but this can happen basically only under proletariat leadership to get rid of the American imperialists from the region. But at the same time, proletarian leadership, means that it will smash the nationalist leadership of both Turkey and the Kurdish liberation movement, because only the proletariat has an interest in uniting the region. Because the national bourgeoisies, even from the oppressed nation, if they need to confront the imperialists, they can lean on the proletariat at some time, even the whole nation, but their own rule is threatened if they unleash the proletariat. So that's why they need to suppress it. Turkey, is a glaring example of that.
I think that explains it kind of very clearly because, as you're talking, I'm like imagining you have a Turkish worker. He says to a Kurdish worker, hello, I support your liberation struggle. And the Kurdish worker says, yeah, I agree. You hate imperialism? Down with imperialism.
Yeah.
It's so simple. But of course, life isn't so simple. There's politics involved. And, that's where the Öcalans of the world and the Erdoğan and Kemals all come in.
But that's the whole problem with nationalist leaders. Everywhere in the oppressed world, they're unable to unite the oppressed masses.
Yeah. And talking about the nationalist leaderships, to our listeners who are maybe not so familiar, our this understanding of the nationalist leadership, the national bourgeoisies of the oppressed countries.
It's important to understand, I think, for everybody, for us, with our orientation, for example, in our international, in terms of our revolution. It's kind of simple, but difficult, obviously.
Right.
Like, who's the enemy? I think it's important for the working class to know who is the main enemy.
Yes.
And this is the imperialists. But the other is who is the obstacle that's standing between the proletariat to smash the imperialists. And this is the national bourgeoisie in oppressed countries. I think that's how, to start, what are the obstacles? And then I think, because nationalism is a big thing in the oppressed nations for good reasons, because of their oppression. But it's important to channel this aspiration of the masses for, national aspiration of the masses for freedom, to take it away from the national bourgeoisie, because that will go back to their own terrain. It will be, if they lead the struggle, either they suppress the proletariat or they bring it to a situation that they're not threatened.
And I think in many ways, what's happening in protests in Turkey really shows this. Erdogan had huge support, but he's increasingly, and it's not just, I think one thing that liberals and leftists, they always talk about Erdogan, and again, I'm coming from the perspective of the dynamics in India. It's the authoritarian strongman Erdogan. They don't like him because he's more dictatorial. Yes, that's true, but that really comes not from his head, or maybe he's a shit person too, but it comes more from his material kind of standing as a representative of this sliver of the Turkish bourgeoisie. This is this weak bourgeoisie that's squeezed.
Yes.
It compels him to resort to more authoritarian measures because of the pressure he's under.
Yes, but the big obstacle, and I think that is one of the big problems of most of the left in Turkey, and I say most because I don't know the left in Turkey so well, is that in order to fight against Erdogan and to fight against the imperialists, like we say, down with Erdogan, down with NATO, you really need to fight independently from the Kemalists.
Exactly, these very forces who... Yeah.
But on which questions? Because many of the left, like the DIP, for example, has correct criticisms against the Kemalists, the CHP. Correct. But they don't touch really the main problem with the Kemalists, which is precisely their pro-US stance. So if you really want to fight against and go back to what is the root of authoritarianism in Turkey, which is imperialist oppression and their army linked to NATO, if you don't have a program against the Kemalists who's completely pro-NATO, you cannot advance the struggle forward, including against Erdogan.
But I guess, for that, you need to first recognize that imperialism is the main enemy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, some they do recognize that is the enemy, But I'm not sure if they understand, I'm not sure if they understand, that this is the enemy, you know?
If well, you obviously can't see, but Anna made a gesture in the air. The main enemy, yes. Okay. All right. So I guess wrapping this up, as I kind of asked at the start, what's the state of the protest? What's the state of the Kurdish struggle? Do we know? Do you have a sense? Is there demoralization? Is there opposition? Is there kind of just defeat? What's going on?
I mean, protests kind of quieted down. It was hitting a holiday, and the state expanded the holiday to make sure it doesn't come back again. But I mean, again, I think to put this sentiment on a way that it can actually carry these questions is going to come from what we talked about.
Yeah.
And well, on the other side, at Kurdistan, there was it's obviously like it's a very a big question after the statement, and it's still in a turmoil with the new Rojava government shaking hands. There has been some protests against the new constitution in Syria based on Islamic law, and also against the Alawite massacres too.
So, am I correct in understanding that it still kind of remains to be settled a little bit in the Kurdish region?
I think so, yeah.
Because I'm just looking, in our article, we call on the Kurdish fighters to reject the betrayal. No to the betrayal. Don't down your arms. So I think if there's still the possibility that there's some ferment, there's some struggle, it's not a done deal, then it's really important to insist that, resist, don't down your arms, and actually draw the lessons of, what road forward for the national liberation struggle in a region that has been completely devastated by imperialist oppression.
Yeah, I think it's very clear. The task is that the Kurdish fighters, they really need to go against the leadership. That's why we call not to surrender their weapons. I think this is just a basic measure of preservation, self-preservation. I'm sorry about my English. So I think the first thing is no, don't give up your weapons. The other thing is how to continue that is that, to organize a struggle for a genuine revolutionary democratic strategy, it really must be centered on the enemy of all people of the region, American imperialism. And what is the essence of this? This is so strong because that actually will speak to the Turkish, to the Syrian, to the Arab, to the Greek masses of the region. That's why
Palestinian.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's why it needs proletarian strategy. And I think that's what the Kurdish fighter should understand, because it's not, that's I think what should happen, to unite and to bring down Erdogan.
Yeah, I think as we kind of start to wrap this up, we've talked a little bit about how Turkey is going to become more strategic for the imperialists, and given the domestic situation, given the external pressures, I think things probably, in my understanding, are going to get more unstable. It looks like. I think it's all the more necessary for those on the left and the militants and nationalists, whoever, to draw the lessons of these struggles. And to really, I think that, the key thing that's posed is to really fight for a leadership that's going to break the hold of the nationalists and open the road to a proper, united anti-imperialist struggle of the peoples in the region.
Yes.
Okay. Is there any other things that you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
One thing, I think it will be very important for Turkish left, Kurdish, to read our statements. I think that because it offers a very different way. It offers this different way. What's the road forward? Because it's based on the correct material understanding of Turkey, I think, which is just the beginning, by the way. We will have more articles to go in depth, but I propose this. And also, if they have questions or disagreements or agreements, of course, they should communicate with us. And we will be very happy to learn and talk.
Yeah, if anybody out there is listening.
I think it will polarize, actually, the Kurdish movement.
Yeah. Especially, it's at a critical turning point. Okay, comrades. Well, thank you for joining me. It was lovely to have you.
Very much.
Thank you for having us.
You're a lovely questioner.
Okay, goodbye.